Boots slammed into wet concrete as the heavy iron door screeched shut. A single bulb flickered overhead, buzzing like an insect trapped in glass. Somewhere deep underground, water dripped steadily. 1, 2, 3, echoing through the stone corridor like a countdown. The women sat in silence. German uniforms, mud-stained, torn at the elbows. Not a single one looked up. A U.S. Army interrogator leaned forward, cigarette smoke curling through the air. The radio behind him crackled with distant artillery, the war still raging above them. He had tried everything already. Threats, promises, names, dates, maps spread across the table. Nothing, not a word. Then he asked one question, and every woman in the room reacted at once. One began to shake. Another whispered something under her breath. A third slowly raised her eyes and started to cry. No one in that room realized it yet, but that question would unravel a secret buried since the final months of World War II, and then something impossible happened. Asterisk it was, early 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing from all sides. Allied forces were pushing deep into Germany, uncovering camps, hidden facilities, and classified military projects the Nazis had sworn would never be found. Among the thousands of prisoners captured were female German soldiers, radio operators, intelligence couriers, auxiliary troops. Officially, they were considered low risk. Unofficially, Allied intelligence knew something wasn't right. These women had been recovered from restricted zones, forests without roads, bunkers erased from maps, villages that didn't officially exist. Their records were incomplete, their units untraceable. And yet, when interrogated, every single one refused to speak. No names, no ranks, no missions. This mattered because entire Allied battalions had vanished in those same regions. Patrols disappeared. Recon teams went silent. Aircraft went down without distress calls. Whatever these women knew wasn't just intelligence. It was connected to disappearances no one could explain. But no one realized yet the real threat hadn't even appeared. Asterisk. The moment that changed everything did not begin with a scream or a gunshot. It began quietly buried in paperwork no one had bothered to translate, in a temporary Allied intelligence office. Stacked with confiscated German files and rain-soaked field reports, a junior analyst noticed a pattern others had missed. Several reports referenced missing Allied patrols in different regions, different months, even different commands, yet all ended the same way. No bodies recovered. No gunfire reported. No resistance encountered. Just silence. What caught his attention wasn't what was written, it was what WASN, single quotes. Every report contained a small, hand-drawn marking in the margin. Sometimes faint. Sometimes Haffarist. Always the same shape. A rough circle intersected by short lines. Drawn as if someone had added it in a hurry or under orders at first. It meant nothing until the analyst cross-referenced. The symbol with personal effects recovered. From the missing dog tags, notebooks, torn, map corners. The same mark appeared. Again and again. He brought the finding to his senior. Interrogator, a man who had spent weeks questioning captured. German female soldiers who refused to speak. The interrogator studied the files in silence, then slowly closed the folder. There's only one way to test this, he said. That night, during an interrogation already going nowhere, the interrogator leaned forward and asked a question no one had tried before. Tell me about the Circle Patrol. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the room broke. One woman shoved her chair backwards so hard, it struck the wall. Another sucked in air like she'd been pulled underwater. A third clutched her own arms, nails digging into skin. Whispering something over and over in German, a warning. Not a response. The silence they had maintained for weeks collapsed in seconds. This wasn't fear of interrogation. This wasn't loyalty to the Reich. This was terror. One of the women finally spoke, not to answer the question, but to beg. You were never supposed to know that name. The interrogator pressed harder. Who was the Circle Patrol? Was it a unit? An operation? A code? Her face drained of color. It wasn't a patrol, she said quietly. It was a boundary. No one in the room understood what she meant, not yet. But at that exact moment, a runner burst into the interrogation chamber with a fresh report from the front lines. Another Allied reconnaissance team had gone missing less than an hour earlier. Same region, same conditions, same silence, and scribbled in the margin of the report, drawn by a shaken survivor who had turned back just in time, was the same symbol, the circle, and the next 90 seconds would determine whether anyone survived. Asterisk. The collapse did not arrive all at once. It crept in through small failures. The kind soldiers learned to ignore because war was full of them. A missed radio check. A delay in resupply. A patrol reporting terrain that didn't quite match the map. Each incident alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to name. The first confirmed anomaly occurred just before dawn. An Allied listening post positioned near a forest corridor reported a sudden drop in ambient noise. Not silence, something stranger. Birds stopped calling. Whined through the trees, faded to nothing. Even distant artillery seemed muffled, as if wrapped in cloth. The operator logged it as atmospheric interference. 10 minutes later, the post went offline. A relief team reached the position an hour later. The equipment was intact, headphones still warm. Coffee cups half finished. No signs of struggle, but the ground told a different story. Footprints led away from the post calm, organized, evenly spaced until they reached the tree line. There the prints curved, not scattered. Not chaotic, they bent inward, arcing slowly, deliberately, until they formed a rough circle approximately 30 meters wide. In the center, nothing. No tracks in or out. Just compressed soil, as if something heavy had stood there briefly, and then vanished. The report reached command within hours. It was dismissed. Inside the interrogation facility, pressure mounted in parallel. The German women sensed it before anyone told them. Guards noticed the shift immediately, the way the prisoners stiffened at the sound of boots, the way they flinched when radios crackled nearby. One woman began counting under her breath whenever the lights flickered. Another refused food unless it was placed outside her cell and left untouched for several minutes. During questioning, a pattern emerged. They did not answer direct questions, but they reacted violently to indirect ones. Maps caused panic. Mentions of forest triggered visible distress. Circles even drawn casually during note-taking resulted in shouting, sobbing, or total shutdown. One interrogator tried a different approach. He slid a blank sheet of paper across the table and asked a woman to draw her unit insignia. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pencil. For several seconds, she did nothing. Then she drew a circle. The pencil snapped in her grip. She screamed. Elsewhere on the front, command cohesion began to break. Orders contradicted each other. Units were rerouted at the last minute. Retcon patrols were canceled, then reinstated, then canceled again. Officers argued over whether certain areas even existed, comparing maps printed months apart that showed different terrain entirely. One map included a clearing. Another showed dense forest. A third showed nothing at all, blank space. Field commanders started marking those areas, themselves not with names, with circles. By mid-morning, the disappearances accelerated. A motorized unit advancing along a logging road reported visual contact with friendly infantry ahead, then lost them behind a shallow rise. When they crested the hill, the road was empty. The forest on both sides stood undisturbed. No tracks, no shelling. No sound. A single helmet lay in the road, placed upright inside it. A folded scrap of paper bearing a crude, circular mark. Command finally reacted. Orders went out to halt all advances through marked zones. Air reconnaissance was dispatched. Planes flew over the coordinates repeatedly, photographing every inch of terrain. The images revealed nothing, no trenches, no fortifications, no enemy movement, just forest. But pilots reported something else, something they couldn't explain. Flying directly over the zones, Instruments malfunctioned. Altimeters jumped erratically. Compasses spun. One pilot claimed the forest canopy below appeared to ripple, like water disturbed by wind. Even though weather reports showed calm conditions, the report was flagged, then buried inside the facility. One woman finally spoke without being asked. "They told us not to watch for too long," she said quietly. "Because once you see it complete, it notices you." The interrogator leaned forward. "What completes?" he asked. She closed her eyes. "The circle." Asterisk, the first verified eyewitness account came from someone who was never supposed to survive. He was a signal runner young. Fast, barely out of training, assigned to relay orders between two forward units operating near one of the newly marked zones. When the radio failed, he ran. By the time he reached the tree line, the air already felt wrong. Not cold, not warm, just empty, like the pressure had dropped inside his chest. He later described the forest as listening. Watching, listening, he followed the sound of movement, ahead boots on leaves until he crested a shallow slope and saw them. The patrol stood in a loose ring. They weren't facing outward toward the forest, they were facing inward. Weapons lowered. Postures relaxed, as if awaiting instructions, he called out. No one turned. That was when he noticed the silence. No breathing. No shifting weight. No clink of gear. The men weren't frozen, they were paused. Like film frames held too long in a projector. Then one of them stepped forward. Not away, inward. The ground beneath that soldier's boot did not depress. It did not break leaves or shift soil. Instead, the surface seemed to accept him slowly, smoothly, until his leg vanished below the knee. He did not react. He did not struggle. He simply continued stepping, sinking deeper with each movement, until the forest floor closed over him completely. The others followed one by one. The runner turned and ran. He didn't stop until his lungs burned and his vision tunneled. When he reached command, he collapsed mid-sentence, repeating only one phrase over and over. They didn't fall. They were taken. Medical staff diagnosed shock. Intelligence flagged. His testimony is unreliable. But the circles kept appearing at headquarters. The realization spread reluctantly, not as certainty, but as fear no one wanted to name. Analysts compared reports from different fronts and found impossible consistencies. Units vanished at similar times of day. The zones formed overlapping patterns that expanded slowly outward, never crossing roads, rivers, or villages, only forests, clearings, and uninhabited land, almost as if avoiding witnesses. That was when someone noticed the detail that changed everything. Missing patrols were not random. They followed curiosity. Units that advanced cautiously kept spacing and withdrew at first signs of anomaly survived. Units that stopped to observe, investigate, or mark the phenomenon disappeared. Observation triggered escalation. Inside the interrogation chambers, this realization broke the last barrier. The women were not soldiers in the conventional sense. They were placed, selected for calmness, for obedience, for the ability to watch without acting. German documents recovered from destroyed facilities revealed the logic behind it. Cold, clinical, and horrifying. Male units tried to engage. They panicked. They pursued. They vanished faster. The women were ordered only to observe boundaries and record changes, never to intervene, never to cross, never to approach once a circle began to form. They were trained to recognize early signs, the hush of sound, the soft curvature of tracks, the way shadows leaned inward instead of away from light. Most importantly, they were trained not to speak about it because naming it accelerated it. One woman finally explained, voice barely audible. It reacts to attention, she said. Maps, questions, orders. Looking for it makes it complete faster. The interrogator asked the question no one wanted answered. What happens when it completes? She stared at him, eyes hollow. It closes, she said. And what's inside is no longer here. By now, Allied command could no longer ignore reality. An emergency directive was drafted and redrafted, then watered down until it sounded like routine protocol. Zones were designated unstable. Patrols were advised to reroute. Aerial observation was limited. Photographic evidence was locked behind clearance levels few officers possessed. Officially, the threat did not exist. Unofficially, a final decision was made. One last controlled entry. If they could document the phenomenon fully, measure it, understand it, they could prevent further losses. A specialized unit was assembled. Volunteers only. Minimal equipment. No radios once inside the zone. The German women reacted violently. When they learned of it, one tried to hang herself with bedsheets. Another attacked a guard to be placed in solitary confinement. A third simply whispered, "You won't be able to come back far enough." The operation launched at dusk. Observers at the perimeter reported visual distortion almost immediately. Trees seemed closer together. Depth perception collapsed. The unit advanced exactly as ordered, marking time, spacing, direction. Then the circle began to form, not on the ground, in the air. Those watching from outside described a faint curvature, a subtle bending of light, like heat shimmer without heat. Sound dropped out. The unit inside continued moving for another 30 seconds. Then, mid-step, they vanished, not faded, not exploded, gone. The circle remained for 3 minutes, then flattened. The ground returned to normal. No crater. No residue. No trace. That was the moment command understood the truth. This was not a weapon. It was not a unit. It was not even an enemy. It was a boundary that moved when noticed, and they had crossed it. Asterisk. By the time Allied command accepted that the phenomenon could not be fought, measured, or mapped like a conventional enemy, the war itself was already racing toward its end. Cities were falling. German lines were collapsing. Files were being burned faster than they could be cataloged. And yet, beneath the chaos of victory, something far more unsettling demanded attention, because it was still active. The disappearance of the volunteer unit could not be explained away. There were too many witnesses, too many synchronized reports, too many senior officers present when the unit vanished mid-step, swallowed not by fire or force, but by absence itself. Men who had endured artillery barrages and mass casualties stood frozen, unable to articulate what they had seen. Several later admitted that the worst part was not the disappearance, it was how ordinary it looked. As if the world had simply decided those men no longer belonged in it. Command issued immediate lockdown orders. All documentation related to circular zones was centralized. Field reports were rewritten. Coordinates were altered. The phrase circle patrol was scrubbed from operational language entirely. What could not be erased was sealed, stamped, and buried beneath layers of classifications so dense that even post-war historians would never know where to look. But containment brought a new problem. The circles did not stop forming as German defenses collapsed. Unexplored regions were suddenly flooded with movement, refugees, retreating units, advancing allies. Areas once avoided out of discipline or superstition were now crossed out of desperation. And with every crossing, the pattern repeated: silence, curvature, disappearance. What made it worse was the timing. The phenomenon accelerated during moments of human focus battles. Searches, interrogations. When attention peaked, so did activity. When fronts stabilized or movement slowed, reports diminished. It was as if the boundary reacted to urgency itself. Inside the interrogation facility, this realization reached a breaking point. The German women sensed the escalation before anyone told them. They always did. Guards reported that several had stopped sleeping entirely, sitting upright through the night, as if waiting for something to finish forming. One woman pressed her ear to the floor repeatedly, insisting she could hear it closing. Another refused to eat, whispering that she needed to remain light enough not to leave an impression. Under mounting pressure, Allied intelligence authorized a final, unrestricted interrogation. No scripts, no constraints. No attempt to protect morale. The interrogator placed a full map of the region on the table, one that included every known circle. every disappearance, every zone of distortion. The women reacted instantly. Some turned away. Some wept openly. One screamed and had to be removed. Only one remained calm. She was older than the others. A radio operator by training, her file showed no disciplinary issues, no ideological extremism, no notable rank. She had survived longer than any of the others assigned to observation duty. When asked why, she answered without hesitation, "Because I stopped looking for the end." She said she explained what German command had learned too late to exploit and too early to escape. The circles were not entrances or traps. They were not weapons deployed by any side. They were closures, corrections in terrain where too much attention, movement, and intent had overlapped. In simple terms, the world was folding back on itself. Asterisk forests were especially vulnerable because they were transitional spaces uninhabited, unmapped, crossed but not settled. When enough human activity converged without purpose, patrols, searches, observations, the boundary stabilized and completed itself. Once complete, anything inside was removed from continuity. Not killed, not destroyed, just no longer present. The reason women were used was not strategic. It was psychological. They were less likely to charge forward, less likely to test boundaries, more likely to obey orders not to engage. Even so, most eventually failed, because humans are not meant to ignore patterns. The interrogator asked the question that hung over every report. Can it be stopped? The woman shook her head slowly. Only delayed, she said, by pretending it isn't there. That answer triggered panic at the highest levels. If attention fed the phenomenon, then every investigation made it worse. Every attempt to warn troops risked accelerating the very thing they feared. The paradox was clear. Silence was safer than knowledge. Yet silence came at a cost. A final incident forced command's hand. 2 days before the German surrender, an Allied unit escorting displaced civilians cut through a forest corridor marked months earlier, but never formally documented as unstable. Hundreds were inside the zone when the first signs appeared. Sound dropped. Children stopped crying. Movement slowed. Commanders ordered an immediate withdrawal. Many managed to escape. Some did not. Afterward, those who survived described seeing companions hesitate, glance back, or stop moving entirely, not paralyzed by terror, but composed, attentive, as though responding to something just beyond audible range. That account was never officially submitted. Instead, choice was made that would shape how the story ended. All remaining German female observers were removed from public documentation. Some were discharged under alternate identities. Others were integrated into post-war intelligence operations. A handful simply disappeared, their files unfinished, their destinations unrecorded. The circles were reassigned as natural irregularities. Patrol losses were explained as battlefield disarray. Forest regions were discreetly restricted with no stated reason. The war concluded. Celebration marches filled the streets. And beneath the festivities, the reality was locked away. But one last signal endured. Recovered months later from a German radio ledger never intended to persist. It was a brief transmission, broadcast repeatedly, never answered. An abruptly ending mid-dash phrase. It stated, "Perimeter stabilizing. Observation finalized. Do not reply. Do not identify it." If this transmission is received, proximity is already too close. That marked the final official acknowledgement of the phenomenon, and still, long after the conflict, long after the women fell silent, long after the documents were sealed, soldiers continued to report forests where sound collapsed, roots that bent without logic, and the disturbing sensation that the land itself was waiting. The war ended, as wars always do, with signatures on documents. Images of leaders exchanging handshakes, and crowds convinced that whatever nightmares had preceded were now safely confined to history. Cities were restored, boundaries redefined, records boxed, cataloged, and stored away with no expectation of review. But some files did not behave as ordinary files should. They resisted organization in the months following victory. Allied archivists observed omissions that could not be blamed on routine loss or combat damage. Entire dossiers cited in registries were absent. Pagination jumped without cause. Maps stopped abruptly, as if the cartographer had halted mid-idea. And whenever inquiries were submitted to recover the missing material, the responses were identical. No such record is on file, yet those who served remembered. Quietly, cautiously, in fragments that never fully formed, an intelligence. Officer recorded privately that there were zones the war declined to. Recall, a supply clerk requested transfer after processing. Orders listing destinations without coordinates. A medical officer documented treating soldiers for trauma who had never engaged the enemy. Only silence. Most unsettling were the letters, personal notes that passed censorship because they seemed innocent. One soldier wrote his spouse about a forest where even footsteps sounded intrusive. Another described a patrol path that kept curving back toward itself regardless of direction. A third letter stopped abruptly, mid-sentence, the ink tapering as though the writer had ceased without lifting the pen. None of these letters explained anything outright. They didn't have to. The German women, meanwhile, slipped from the historical record. Officially, they were processed like countless other prisoners questioned, released, returned home, or reassigned into post-war systems. Unofficially, their fates diverged sharply. Some lived extended, uneventful lives under assumed names. Some vanished between transfer locations. A few later surfaced in intelligence positions within Allied agencies, their pasts carefully erased. What linked them all was silence. Not a single confirmed public interview exists. No autobiographies. No sworn testimony. Even decades later, when wartime secrecy loosened and former operatives spoke openly, these women remained silent. One researcher located a surviving radio operator in the 1970s. She lived alone near the boundary of a forest, declined all visitors, and rejected every interview request. When asked why she had never spoken of her wartime experiences, she reportedly answered only, "There are memories you don't survive by revisiting." Classified documents released piecemeal over the years suggested what had been concealed. Redacted memos referenced restricted interaction zones. Environmental surveys were ordered for regions showing no geological explanation. Training guides subtly advised patrol leaders to avoid unmapped curvature and sound void sectors. Without elaboration, most disturbing was a directive issued in the late 1940s, buried among standard post-war procedures. It instructed officers to discourage unnecessary investigation into unexplained disappearances and warned that continued inquiry may elevate operational hazard. No adversary was identified, no danger defined, only hazard in the decades that followed. Reports never fully ceased. Cold War units bypassed certain forests without understanding why. NATO exercises rerouted around areas marked only with vague caution indicators. Civilian hikers vanished in groupings that defied probability, always without evidence of struggle. Always without trace, modern search and rescue teams occasionally reported the same sensations noted generations earlier. Abrupt silence. Warped spatial awareness. Trails that subtly guided them back toward their starting point. Most incidents were attributed to confusion, stress, or terrain illusion, but some reports were sealed. Even now, the most recent reference to the phenomenon appeared not in a military document, but in an archive request refusal. Issued in the early 2000s, a historian seeking clarification on missing World War II patrol files received a brief reply, stating the material was restricted. Due to unresolved continuity issues, the word lingered, as though the matter had never been resolved, only controlled. As though the boundary had not disappeared with the war, but had simply learned patience. And perhaps that explains why the women never spoke. Not because of loyalty, not because of fear of consequence, but because they grasped something the rest of the world did not. That certain questions do not uncover answers. They form patterns. And once those patterns are complete, what lies within them does not return. The archives remain sealed. The forests still stand. And somewhere, in places no one is meant to chart too carefully, the silence continues to bend, calm, unseen, and complete, until someone asks the wrong question once more.